What if I told you that the Prophet Muhammad signed a written treaty, a real, formal document, to protect Christian monks? Not just a promise, not just a speech. A signed covenant that has been honored for over 1,400 years. This is one of the most important stories in Islamic history, and most people, Muslim and non-Muslim, have never heard it. My name is Muhammad, and on Path to Islam, we share the real history and real teachings of Islam. Stay with me for the next 6 minutes, because this story is going to change the way you see the Prophet Muhammad. Before we talk about the covenant, let's understand who the monks were. St. Catherine's Monastery sits at the base of Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula, the same mountain where, according to all three Abrahamic religions, Moses received the 10 Commandments. The monastery was founded in the 6th century, around 565 CE, by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. It was built to house a Christian community of monks dedicated to prayer, study, and the preservation of sacred texts. By the early 7th century, these monks were living in a changing world. Islam was spreading. The Islamic State based in Medina was growing in influence. And for a small community of Christian monks living in a remote desert monastery, the future was uncertain. So they did something that took real courage. They sent a delegation to the Prophet Muhammad directly. They traveled to Medina, and they asked him for protection. What happened next is the part of history that most people never learn. The Prophet Muhammad received the delegation and he responded, not with a vague promise, not with a brief reassurance, but with a written covenant. This document is known today as the Ashtiname of Muhammad. Historians also call it the Charter of Privileges or the Covenant of the Prophet. Let me walk you through what it actually said. First, protection of life. The covenant stated that every Christian under Islamic rule was to be fully protected. No one was permitted to harm them. Second, freedom of worship. Christians had the right to practice their faith completely and openly. Their ceremonies, their prayers, their way of life, all protected. Third, no forced conversion. The Prophet made it absolutely clear, no Christian was ever to be forced into Islam. Faith must be freely chosen. Full stop. Fourth, protection of churches and monasteries. Christian places of worship could not be seized, destroyed, repurposed, or turned into mosques. They were sacred and they were safe. Fifth, religious self-governance. Christians retained the right to appoint and keep their own bishops and religious leaders. No one from outside their community could interfere in that. Sixth, economic protection. Christians were not to be burdened with unfair taxation or treated unjustly in trade and daily life. And then the Prophet added something that makes this document extraordinary. He declared, any Muslim who violates this covenant has broken the covenant of God and the covenant of his Prophet. He anchored the protection of Christians to divine accountability. This wasn't just a political agreement. It was a moral and religious obligation. Here's the part that makes this story impossible to dismiss. St. Catherine's Monastery is still standing today. It has been continuously operating since the 6th century. It is one of the oldest active Christian monasteries in the entire world. It sits in what is now modern-day Egypt, in the Sinai Desert, and it has been there through the rise and fall of empires, through wars, through centuries of political and religious change. And for most of that history, it has existed under the protection of the covenant written by the Prophet of Islam. When Muslim armies later entered the Sinai region, the monastery was not touched. When there were questions raised by later rulers about the status of the monks, copies of the Ashtiname were produced, and the monastery remained safe. The monastery actually holds a copy of the covenant to this day. That's how seriously this promise was taken. That's not a claim. That's history. Documented, physical, standing history. This story matters deeply, especially right now. We live in a time when Islam is constantly in the headlines. When people hear the word Islam, many picture conflict, intolerance, hostility toward people of other faiths. But the Ashtiname of Muhammad tells a completely different story. It tells us that the Prophet Muhammad, the founder of Islam, the man whose example over 1 billion Muslims follow, personally guaranteed the rights of Christians to live freely, worship freely, and be protected under Islamic governance. It tells us that Islam, from its earliest days, was not about forcing anyone into anything. It was about justice. And it tells us that this wasn't theoretical. It was written down. It was sealed. It was honored for over 1,400 years. Now, does that mean every Muslim ruler in history lived up to this standard? No. Humans are imperfect. But the standard itself, set by the Prophet at the very beginning of Islam, was clear, documented, and powerful. That standard deserves to be known. If you're someone who is curious about Islam, whether you're exploring it for the first time or trying to understand it better, stories like this are exactly what you need. Not headlines. Not social media debates. The actual history. The Ashtiname of Muhammad is not a secret. It's in the historical record. Scholars know it. It's been studied. It exists. But most people have never heard of it, because the loud, dramatic stories drown out the quiet, powerful ones. You now know this story. And knowledge like this is meant to be shared. The Prophet Muhammad made a promise to a group of Christian monks 1,400 years ago. That promise protected a monastery that still stands today. That promise said, "Your life, your faith, your church, they are safe. And any Muslim who violates this is going against God himself." This is Islam, not the version in the headlines. The real one. If this video gave you something to think about, share it with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe to Path to Islam for more real history and real teachings. And if you have questions about Islam, drop them in the comments. I read every single one. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you.